you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a Senior Associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa requirements and the renewal considerations, but just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that our firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the U.S. on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN, a B, and an H-1B. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including E-2s, E-1s, TNs, L-1s, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5s, and extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, such as those with lower investment amounts. And we've processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. And at the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. So this webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We'll also send you a link for that. We do encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button, as we do regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We will also send you a link where you can arrange for a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So today I will be presenting the first half of the webinar, and we are also joined by our partner, Kelly Weiner, who will present the last half. Kelly does have extensive experience working with E-2 visas. She has helped clients secure their E-2 visas around the world, and especially those that would be considered higher risk. So she's an excellent resource on this topic. So without further delay, we will get started with the webinar. Okay, so we're going to start with discussing just the E-2 visa requirements first. So the E-2 visa is for entrepreneurs, and you must be national of a treaty country. This means that you need to have a passport from an E-2 treaty country. The Department of State does have a list available on their website of these E-2 treaty countries, and occasionally the list is updated with additions and changes, but currently there are over 80 listed countries. So as I stated, you need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. However, that doesn't mean you need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. So as an example, if you are born in India and you later become a Canadian citizen, because you have that Canadian passport, you would meet this requirement. So another requirement would be that the E-2 company must be owned at least 50% by the national of the treaty country. So the business can take almost any forms, like an LLC or corporation, but you need to own at least 50% of that company. So you can own exactly 50%, 100%, but if it falls below that 50% threshold, then you wouldn't qualify on this element. And you do need to continuously meet the E-2 requirements throughout the time you hold that E-2 visa. So if you're ever considering selling the equity in the company, you need to be careful, because you would then maybe not qualify for the E-2. So next, you need to be coming to the U.S. to direct and develop that E-2 business. This means you as a E-2 investor will be coming to the U.S. To really run the business. So you wouldn't be permitted to work for a different company. You wouldn't be permitted to have side jobs. The intent would be that you're really coming to the U.S. to direct and develop this specific E-2 company. Another requirement is that you must make a substantial investment in the business. So what is substantial? We will discuss this a little bit later on in the presentation. And it's generally not a fixed dollar amount, but it's the amount really needed to get that company up and running. So next, the funds you invest must be at risk and irrevocably committed. This means it's not enough to simply set up a business bank account for your E-2 company and transfer the funds into the bank account. You do need to spend the funds and commit them, such that they would be at risk for loss. So if you transfer $100,000 from your personal bank account into your E-2 business bank account, you would then need to spend those funds on things to make the business operational. For example, executing a lease, obtaining inventory, getting your equipment, spending it on marketing fees, legal fees, things to set up the E-2 business. You do want to show the government officer that you have everything you need for that E-2 company to be fully operational. It is permissible to have some money, some of the investment set aside for working capital. So again, say you invested that $100,000 and you've spent maybe 75% of it. You could then hold, that $25,000 remaining in your business bank account and reserve it for the working capital. We would still say that your investment is $100,000. So next, how much is enough? We'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but again, you just want to keep in mind the type of business that you're starting and what is the reasonable startup cost associated with that type of business. So you do need to consider the type of business and what does that business specifically need to make it fully operational. So depending on the business, that could vary between the different businesses. Next, we do have source of funds. So the government needs to be satisfied that the source of funds is lawful and legitimate. So the scope of what is acceptable is quite broad. You can use gifts from friends, family members, that sort of thing. You can also use loans, as long as loans are secured by your personal assets, not secured by the E-2 company. You can even use your inheritance. You can use income earned from business where you've been employed for several years. If you own another company, you could get money from as a shareholder distribution or a shareholder loan, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of permissible ways to obtain the money for the investment. And the government is quite accepting of many types of sources as long as it is lawful and legitimate. So regarding the lawful and legitimate, we do emphasize that the government can have a pretty high documentation requirement to show where you got those funds from. So you do need to be able to make sure you can show the government and document where the money came from. This is a case, especially if you're in the U.S. and you're applying with USCIS. Conversely, a lot of consulates have page limitations, so they may not require you to show everything upon submission, but it is advisable that you still have the documentation and evidence to show where the funds came from. So the next requirement is that the business must be real and operating. So what this means is that the moment you arrive in the U.S. with your E-2 visa, that you're ready to begin operating that business. So again, you need to be able to show that you've bought everything the business needs to be operational, and you have proof in the application that you've taken all those necessary steps. So you can include within that application, the commercial lease, evidence that you have the inventory, equipment, everything that you need for the business to be operational and that you've paid for it. If you're buying an existing business, then you could show that the business is already operational by providing evidence like the tax returns, invoices, payroll records, licenses, or things like that. There's also a requirement called the marginality requirement, which means that the business must support more than just the investor and their family. So the way this really translates to is that you must hire U.S. workers to work at that business. Or if you purchase the business, then continue to employ U.S. workers who already work there. Lastly, you must also have the intent to return to your home country if the E-2 status ends. So while this is kind of a very low standard to prove for your non-immigrant intent, you still just need to provide to the government some type of evidence or statement showing that you do intend to return to your home country when the E-2 status expires. Okay, so we'll discuss a little bit about options and timing for obtaining your E-2 visa. So there are kind of two ways to get the E-2 visa. So one is that you're going to start a business here in the U.S. So with a startup business, you would need to invest funds, put it in a business bank account, and then use those funds for various expenses to get that business operational. The other option could be to purchase an existing business in the U.S. So some people do prefer to purchase an existing business because you could possibly protect your investment a little bit more using escrow. So with that, you would, if you're purchasing an existing business using escrow, the buyer and seller execute a purchase and sale agreement, and all the conditions of the transaction are satisfied except for the approval of that E-2 visa. So rather than the funds going straight to the seller, the purchase funds are deposited into an account with an escrow agent. The funds are then held in escrow with instructions that if the E-2 visa is approved, the funds are released to the seller. If the E-2 visa is denied, then they would be returned to the buyer. So for some investors, this is an attractive option because it kind of provides that added layer of protection for their investment compared to just starting a new business in the U.S. So how long is your E-2 visa valid for? So the validity dates of the E-2 visa can vary depending on the country you're from. So it could be from it could vary from 3 months to 5 years. It just depends where you have that passport from the E2 treaty country. However, you should keep in mind though that even if you're eligible for a 5-year visa, an officer does have discretion to limit the length of your visa. Reasons they may limit it could be just depending on the strength of the case. They may want you to come back to the consulate after a couple of years to renew it just to ensure that you do still qualify or you're eligible for that E2 visa. So while an officer can limit the length of your visa, using their discretion, they can't actually grant you longer than the allotted time listed on that reciprocity schedule. So once you have the visa, the valid visa means that you can seek entry into the U.S. So when an E2 investor enters the U.S., CBP will issue them what is called the I-94. And generally, each time you enter the U.S. in that valid E2 status, CBP will issue you that I-94 showing that you have 2 years of authorized stay. So this period is independent of the visa stamp expiration date in many cases. But while you're in the U.S. under that E2 status, the I-94 is what proves as evidence that you're authorized to be here and that you're authorized to work for that E2 company. So as long as that I-94 admit date has not expired, you are legally allowed to continue working here in the U.S. for that qualifying E2 business. And then each time you enter the U.S. with that valid E2 visa, CBP will typically refresh that I-94 and give you another 2 years, extending your ability to remain here and work here. So regardless of whether your visa is valid for 3 months or 5 years, you typically just get that 2-year period of authorized stay from CBP when you enter the U.S. The moment you leave the U.S. is when the visa validity period becomes relevant. So if you do have a 3-month visa, but you have that 2 years of authorized stay on your I-94, then you could stay here in the U.S. for those 2 years. But if you want to travel, that's when that 3-month visa becomes more relevant. So if you need to travel and that 3 months has already passed, your visa is expired, you would need to go back to the consulate to renew your visa and get another one. Lastly, with the I-94s, there is a high rate of errors with the I-94, so we do always recommend that you each time you enter the U.S. that you check your I-94 because it does govern your status here in the U.S. So you should check each time you enter. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how much investment is enough. So this is a common question people ask when they're trying to get that E2 visa. But with the E2 visa, there's no set amount required by the regulations for what is enough. So sometimes people get that confused. The E2 visa confused with the EB-5 program, where so that EB-5 is an immigrant investor program that can lead to the green card, and it does require a specific investment amount. The E2, on the other hand, is temporary non-immigrant, and it doesn't have that set investment amount. Instead, the E2 regulations require that the investor make a substantial investment. And what qualifies as substantial does depend on the type of business being established. It may also vary based on where you're applying. It could vary based on the consular officer reviewing your case and the overall strength of your application. So ultimately, that investment amount is evaluated in context of the business, the totality of the circumstances. The important thing to show and keep in mind is that you've invested enough for the business to be fully operational and show that you have invested a minimal amount in the eyes of the government officer. So the government does have what they call proportionality tests, which officers will use to evaluate that investment. In general, the test compares the amount you're investing to the total cost of the business that you're buying or creating. So the question is whether that investment represents a meaningful percentage of what is required for the business to function successfully. So that proportionality test will work on a sliding scale. So the lower cost businesses would require a higher percentage of investment. So, for example, a small business costing $100,000 to be operational and set up may require you to invest 100% of the cost. Conversely, the higher cost businesses would require a lower percentage of investment. So, if you're starting a business that costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, a smaller percentage may be considered substantial. So, the substantial nature of that multi-million dollar investment can satisfy that this investment is substantial just because of the amount of money. So with your application, you would just want to explain to the consular officer why your particular amount does represent a reasonable and credible startup cost for the specific type of business that you are going to operate. So with your application, you would want to provide some supporting documentation for that. So you could provide things like evidence like industry reports, market research, business plans, cost analysis. Those types of evidence can help demonstrate why the amount you have invested is sufficient to launch that business. Again, just in general, if you're making a relatively modest investment, it is important to show that you have committed 100% of those funds required to get the business up and running. So you would want to demonstrate that all the essential startup costs have been funded and the business is it's ready to be operational. So next, if you are purchasing an existing business through an arm's length transaction, meaning that the sale is taking place on the open market, is not between friends and family members, then the purchase price will generally be considered evidence of a substantial investment. So in most cases, the fair market value of the business serves as a strong indicator of whether the investment meets that E-2 requirement. However, the purchase price should be consistent with the underlying value and performance of the business. So, for example, if the company's financials, their records show that this is a really highly profitable business and they own a lot of assets, yet the purchase price is very low, then the consular officer may have more questions for you about how the value is determined. So the purchase price should make sense in light of the business revenues, the profitability, assets, that sort of thing, the overall market value. If you are going to purchase a business from friends or family members, you should expect to have a little more scrutiny from the government officers. So in those situations, it might be helpful to obtain an independent business valuation or appraisal of the business. This can provide that objective evidence that the purchase price does reflect the fair market value of the business and that the investment is substantial for that E-2 purpose. So franchises can also be a good option for the E-2 visa applicants. So you may choose to purchase an existing franchise, or you can acquire a franchise rights and then establish the new franchise. That's permissible. One advantage of investing in a franchise is that, it provides this proven business model. It has this established brand recognition. You might have some operational support, that sort of thing. So from an E-2 perspective, that well-developed business concept might be more attractive to help, you decide what you're going to do. So next, we also have expenditures for that E-2 business. So if you're Starting a new business, your investment will typically consist of expenditures that you need to establish and operate the business. So, for that reason, it is important to focus on expenses that directly contribute to the creation and functionality of the business, what will make it functional. Some of the strongest E2 expenditures include items like marketing and advertisement, website development, your equipment, software, inventory, your office space, any business licenses that you might need, things to form the actual business, like your corporate documents, other professional services related to just setting up that business. These are typical business expenditures, and they are considered some of the stronger E2 expenditures. Um, on the other hand, there are expenditures that we would consider not strong E2 expenditures. So those are generally given little weight in the E2 analysis. Examples of that would include airline tickets, your hotel stay, meals, or other personal travel expenses associated with maybe visiting the US. In fact, some consults do specifically note in their guidance that these costs shouldn't be included as part of the investment. So they're kind of viewed more as personal costs rather than expenditures to help create or enhance the business itself. So similarly, the immigration related fees for the petition are typically not considered strong E2 investment expenses. So for example, the filing fees paid to USCIS or your visa application fee, the government doesn't generally count those towards the investment. Legal fees incurred in connection with preparing that E2 application can be included. They're generally considered a little less persuasive, but you can include them as part of the expenditures. In general, you just want to keep in mind what is essential to really launching and operating the business that would be needed, and those would be your expenditures. Okay. So next, do you have to hire employees for your E2 visa? And the answer is yes. So hiring employees is an important part of meeting the E2 visa's marginality requirement. So the business must have the present and future capacity to provide for more than just the investor and their family. So in other words, the enterprise should have a broader economic impact and contribute to the U.S. economy. So one of the primary goals of the E2 program is to promote that economic activity between the treaty country and the United States. So as a result, consular officers will look closely as to how that business will benefit the U.S. Economy. So demonstrating that your business will create jobs for U.S. workers is one of the strongest ways to really show that you satisfy this requirement. As a general guideline, we usually recommend that your plan shows that you'll hire 3 to 5 employees within within the first 5 years of operations. There is no legal minimum requirement, but having a credible hiring plan showing you can hire 3 to 5 people will help strengthen your application. So when evaluating the types of employees that you might hire for your business, W-2 employees are generally viewed more favorably than the 1099 independent contractors. So if your business does rely more on contractors who are paid relatively small amounts, that may provide limited support for meeting that marginality requirement. But that said, it does depend on, again, always on the type of business that you're planning to start. There are certain industries like construction where it is more common to employ contractors than versus traditional W-2 employees. So if you were going to operate some type of um, business like construction where you would employ a lot of 1099 contractors, it would still be possible for you to argue that the business has that meaningful economic impact and does satisfy that marginality requirement. If that was a situation, the type of business you are going to operate, something where you are going to employ a lot of 1099 employees, we would still advise if possible, that you try to employ 1 to 2 W-2 employees whenever possible. Um, just as a note, some adjudicators and consular officers do really place a lot of weight on whether or not you will directly employ someone with that W-2 versus the 1099. So how do you prove that marginality requirement? So for startup businesses, the primary evidence would be your business plan, which we will discuss a little bit more in the later slide. But the plan should really include a realistic hiring strategy, your projection for employees, their positions, how much you will pay them, their benefits, payroll expenses, other financial forecasts, that type of thing. And then again, your projections within that business plan should always be reasonable and consistent with the nature of your E-2 enterprise that you plan to operate. Um, Other types of evidence could include letters of intent from potential clients, if you've obtained contracts already for the business, anything like that can help strengthen your case. If you're going to purchase an existing business, you can rely on the historical records to help demonstrate that the job creation, the economic impact is there. So useful evidence would include past payroll records, the W-2 forms, pay stubs, tax records that the business has already generated or has. But when evaluating a business for purchase, we do also say it is important to consider the employment history of the business. So if you're thinking of purchasing a business and it's been operating for several years, but they do not employ any U.S. workers, then you might want to look at that as that would possibly be a negative factor when considering to buy it, because if you now have this business and you're showing the consular officer this is a business you're buying, but they haven't employed U.S. workers in the past, they might question whether or not you will employ U.S. workers in the future, and you might not meet that marginality requirement. So generally, a business that has a track record where they have already employed past U.S. workers will be a stronger foundation for that E-2 application. But again, the ultimate goal is just to demonstrate that the business is not just for self-employment, but a bona fide business that will contribute to the U.S. economy through that job creation and ongoing commercial activity. Okay, so now we are going to switch to our partner, Kelly, who will go ahead and start discussing the business plans.
Thank you, Katie. All right, so what should a business plan contain for an E-2 application? The most important thing is the executive summary. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you sell to? Um, the officer will often skim the business plan, and so you really want to have a strong executive summary that just leaves the officer with a very clear picture of what your business does. Other important parts of the business plan are kind of market analysis and research, so just proof that you know that you're going to have clients. A marketing plan, so how you're going to sell to those clients. Most businesses should have a website, some type of visible presence, and kind of a clear explanation for how you're actually going to get clients in the United States. A personnel plan is also very important. This is really key to show that you're going to meet the marginality requirement and that the business is going to support and hire US workers. You want to include a 5-year hiring projection. And we generally recommend showing you're going to hire at least 3 to 5 full-time employees by the end of year 5 or more. Also very important to have a comprehensive financial plan. This is 5 years of financial projections, including an income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow statement with kind of a common sense explanation that the officer can easily follow to explain why these numbers are reasonable. If you do have someone else draft your business plan, it's also very important that you sit down with it and that you understand that business plan. So it wouldn't go over well at the interview if the officer says, well, why are these numbers realistic? And you say, I don't know, the business plan drafter, said that this would work. So you do need to understand the numbers. If you're not drafting it yourself and you have questions about the numbers, you should be, asking about those to make sure that you can provide an explanation as the business owner to explain why the company is going to make money, and, be able to support like all these employees in the United States. All right, let's talk about some different E-2 visa considerations. So should you go to USCIS or the consulate? So this really is going to vary by your specific situation. The benefit of USCIS is if you're already in the US in a status that allows you to change status, like you're here on a B1, you're here on an H1B. Then a change of status with USCIS may be open to you. The benefit is you don't have to leave the United States. You can pay the government to get a faster response within 15 business days. That can be an approval, a denial, or a request for more evidence or notice of intent to deny. Uh, if it's a request for evidence or notice of intent to deny, you'd prepare a response, submit it, and then you'll get usually a final answer 15 business days after that. Additionally, USCIS allows you, often they're more accepting towards lower investment amounts. It does have to make sense in light of your business. So, if you have a business that has really high asset requirements, that's not going to work. But if it's a service-based business, they may be more open to those lower investment amounts, 35, 45,000, where many consulates, that's not going to be sufficient. Um, the downside is when you apply for this change of status, you're getting a 2-year approval to live and work in the US, but it doesn't allow for international travel. So it is very restrictive in that way for people that need to travel frequently outside the US, or for people who have the option to get, maybe a 5-year multi-entry visa. A change of status, often isn't the right choice. Another issue with a USCIS filing is that they are extremely, extremely focused on the source and trail of funds. So if you do have a complex source and trail of funds, USCIS may not be a good option for you unless you can document every single step from where you received the money up until the money was spent on E-2, investment or to purchase an E-2 business. Um, so let's talk about consular filings. So at a consulate, the benefit of this is that you're going to get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for international travel. For many countries, that means a multi-year, multi-entry visa. There are some countries like Egypt, like Bangladesh, where there's a very short reciprocity period for the visa. When you enter on that visa, even if it's valid for only 3 months, you will get 2 years in E2 status. But then every time you travel internationally, you have to go get a new visa. So it really does depend on kind of your specific country of nationality. But for many, many people, the consulate is a really good option, especially if you're outside the United States, you're not here. The consulate is really your only option. You can't kind of enter on ESTA, for example, and change status, or if you don't have a US visa yet, generally applying for at the consulate is going to be your first step. Consulates also tend to take kind of a more holistic, high-level view of the source and trail of funds. So if you do have a very complex source and trail of funds, sometimes going to the consulate can be more beneficial for that. And again, just that benefit of being able to travel, internationally. Um, Source and trail of funds, so particularly for USCIS filing. So as I said, if you're doing a source and trail of funds for USCIS, they're going to want to document every single step. So if it's, savings you earned from employment, at a consulate, you may be able to provide some years of tax returns and then proof of you transferring the money, through a lump sum to the E2 business bank account. If you were doing a filing with USCIS, they would want to see the tax returns, the pay stubs, your bank statement showing the money entering the account and being maintained there. If the money was transferred out anywhere else or if it was used up, then that's not going to show the maintenance of funds that you need. So it can be much more complex with the source and trail of funds if you're doing USCIS or a consulate, that is more focused on it and has higher requirements in that regard. Loans secured by company assets. So if you have a loan, for the E2 investment, that is okay if it is a personal loan or if it is an unsecured loan, or it's secured by your personal property. For example, you own a home and you take out a second mortgage. What is not permitted is a loan secured by the assets of the E2 company. This comes up a lot in seller financing situations. So, for example, uh, if you're purchasing a business and maybe you put down 50% and then 50% is seller financing secured by the assets of the E2 company, that's not going to work well for an E2. So for gifts are permitted. Um, but gifts, are something where you do also have to provide the money or the source of trail of funds for the actual gift giver. So the gift giver does have to be someone who is willing to provide all of those documents to you. Considerations for a small investment amount. So you can get a letter of intent, you can get a CPA letter. These things are also very helpful in showing that you have a business that actually can work for the E2. E2 visas for two investors. So this can work, but it has to be a 50-50 scenario. Um, all right. Uh, Substantive changes to the business after filing. So once you get your E2, you cannot just work anywhere or do anything. You can only work when you actually have authorization to do that particular type of business. So, for example, if you starting a restaurant, you cannot just switch and open a different company, like a wedding photography company. Also, if there's any change to the ownership. So, for example, if there are 50% you own, and now you've sold 30%, you only own 20%. At that point, you are, no longer eligible for the E2. Higher risk cases. So these are things like real estate, equity trading, family business purchases. We have another webinar that goes over in detail all of the issues, that can come up with each of these. For real estate, they're often concerned it's just a passive investment. You want to make sure that it's not just you collecting rental income from some properties you own. For equity trading, similarly, it's not just kind of personal trading. Family business purchases, they're going to want to know, like, is this a fair market value? Um, uh, like, is this a fair market value for the business that you're purchasing? Uh, and we can go to the next slide. All right, so common reasons for E2 denials, low investment amount, nature of the business. Real estate equity issues, some investment amounts are just going to be too low. Even if you can make an argument that you can start a business with $2,000, that's just never going to be sufficient, for the E2. We've had clients before that have, for example, sent maybe spent 2,000 and put 98,000 in the business bank account, got denied on their own, came to us, and then were able, to spend more money and ultimately get approved. So low investment amount can be um, one way that uh, you can improve and then reapply. Uh, Filing location and venue. So certain consulates are just not very friendly to E2s. They are uh, kind of either used to seeing very large multinational businesses, or sometimes they, just are not as familiar with E2s or just not as friendly to E2s. So it is important to understand your filing location and venue um, when you're doing an E2 filing to understand, what are the odds that you'll be able to actually, do this successfully. A client has a business in a home country that does not have employees, or if there's concern over whether the business will create jobs for US workers. These are kind of similar reasons for denial, marginality reasons. And so this is something that, you do have to address if you have had a business in your home country that doesn't have employees. You want to maybe hire someone before you are applying for your E2. You want to have a strong business plan. If you're purchasing a company, you want to make sure that company has like a record of hiring. All right. What does it take to renew an E2 visa? Hiring US workers. This is key. Uh, You also want to hire, as we said, 3 to 5 full-time workers, provide updated financial data, so tax returns, for 2 years. Some consulates ask for 5 years if you had a 5-year visa. Explain, is the company profitable? Is there kind of payroll, information that's available to show that you're going to have, employees or you currently have employees? If the company is not doing well, you can provide proof that you are planning to hire employees. So maybe kind of a mini business plan. You also want to show that the company still meets the E2 requirements. So ownership changes, changes to the type of business, uh, these can be problematic if you are under 50% ownership. If there's been a major change to the business that's kind of not a natural outgrowth, this can be a problem. Uh, so this is something to consider. All right. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so developments and adjudication trends. E-2 visas do have high approval rates, so 80 to 90% is posted by the US government. They have continued to have high approval rates, even when there are, kind of issues with immigration generally. Investment purchases in the US, this is something that you want to focus on. Uh, and it's not a requirement, but can be helpful. Um, the government does want to see higher investment amounts. So this is kind of something that just creeps up over time. What is a realistic, kind of way to, kind of start a business? Maybe 10 years ago, the amount that you could use to start the business is less than it is now. So they do want to see those higher investment amounts. Hiring of US citizens. So this is very important. The E2 is meant to facilitate, economic benefit between two countries. And so it is very, important to kind of hire U.S. citizens to show you'll meet that marginality requirement. Focus on employees rather than contractors. Employees are much stronger than contractors. Administrative processing. This is something we're seeing more and more. Uh, and it does mean one of two things. One is that the government wants to uh, get more information from you. So sometimes they'll issue administrative processing if they have, kind of an issue with the application or they want more information. The other administrative processing that can happen is that it's a security issue where they've flagged you by a security agency. And at that point, the consulate has no ability to kind of do anything until the security agency has released your file from the flag. So that can take, a longer period of time to get that resolved. More USCIS filings. So I think, although most consulates have returned to normal processing, post-pandemic, we still see many USCIS filings. People sometimes prefer that if they're already in the United States and the ability to kind of pay an additional fee and get, some extra reassurance on the timeline can sometimes be helpful. And we are seeing kind of generally longer waits at consulates. This really depends. There's certain consulates where the wait is extremely long. There's certain, times where the consulate is, kind of very fast. It really just depends on kind of where you're located, unfortunately. And because there is kind of less ability to do any type of, kind of switching between consulates. You can't really do third country national processing anymore. Um, at that point, you're just stuck kind of with the consulate in the location where you live or where you're a national. All right. All right. So we have many questions that have come in. We'll cover some of them. I'm going to go through the first, quickly, and Katie will do some as well. Someone said my brother stays in Virginia. Some said I'm not sure what this means. So for any that are kind of extremely specific to your situation, what we would suggest is that you contact us to set up a specific consultation to go over your issue. Someone said, I want to avoid change of status because getting the E-2 visa stamp at the US Embassy in Egypt later will be more difficult. Not necessarily. It is true there are some consulates that do not like it when you have changed your status if they feel that you kind of misrepresented your initial reason for getting a visa. Additionally, if you go back and the business is not doing well, that can be kind of more complex, but it's not necessarily the case. We do have many clients that kind of do a change of status and then go get their E-2 visa stamp, but it is, something you want to consider strategically. Um, what are the most important requirements for an E-2 visa applicant who plans to buy an existing franchise? How important are historical profits and future projections? Can the purchase price be kept in escrow? So we've covered some of this. So yes, to go from the last question, yes, the purchase price can be kept in escrow with funds released to the seller upon E2 visa approval if the seller agrees to that. Historical profits are important. If you're purchasing an existing franchise that's already running, you want to see that it has good profits, good revenues, good hiring. Someone says, I've fully documented legitimate funds in my local currency due to banking restrictions. I'm considering a peer-to-peer agreement. So I think that, again, like if you have a very specific situation like this, I think setting up a consultation is the best route. Um, Potentially this could be a legitimate path of funds, but it really is going to depend on, exactly what you can provide, in terms of documentation. Can my wife file a Form I-539 to extend her E-2 status, even though I'm currently outside the US? So generally, no. You can only extend your E-2 status if the E-2 investor or employee is actually, maintaining their own status. So you would have to be in the United States for that. Um, in terms of what's the safest alternative to avoid a status violation, leave before your I-94 expires, and then either re-enter on your valid E-2 visa or go get a new valid E-2 visa. Um, would any of our guidance change if someone is in the US on another work visa and applying for change of status? I think that, again, if for any questions on a specific situation, a consultation is the best option. It is viable to switch from an E3 to an E2. The important thing if you're in the US is that you've been maintaining your status in the United States, and you can prove that. How does the E2 work if I go for the corporate side, E2 for employees? I'm not sure exactly what this is asking. It is possible, of course, to register an E2 company and then send through E2 employees. You still have to meet all the E2 requirements. So whoever the investor is, whether that's a business, whether that's an individual, needs to invest a substantial amount and meet all other requirements as described. Um, what is a better strategy via consular processing and funds held in an escrow or entering doing a change of status? Um, so again, like this is really going to depend on your situation. I often think though that the first 2 years of a business can be quite difficult to have, strong revenues and strong profits. And then if you do that and then you're going to the embassy, you have to defend the business's position. So if the business has done well, then you're in a better position. But if it hasn't done well, it can be more challenging. All right. Um, all right. So I believe that we have covered the questions. So I think we will close here. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.